Okay, well, good morning, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm delighted to be here this morning in Ireland, but evening for Andrew. I'm here with Dr. Andrew Wilson, who's a core member of Cultivate, and a principal at Risk Minds. He's a former Australian food safety regulator with more than 15 years' experience, specializing in regulatory policy development and implementation, particularly integrating technology-enabled solutions. A thing that particularly fascinates me is your interest in um, organizational culture and human behavior, Andrew, which helps support both compliance and other strategic outcomes. A thing I'm a big believer in. You bring a really strong understanding of that aspect of cultural dynamics and mindsets, and combining that with data analytics to shape effective food safety and public health risk management, I think is going to be, a key topic for us today. So, thanks for joining us, Andrew. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Crane, and thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening, my time. It's a very it's a topic that's very close to my heart. So thank you. I very much appreciate the opportunity.
Pleasure. So this is the second part in a series on this topic. How retailers, buyers, and regulators evaluate suppliers in terms of food safety. So we had a great conversation with Sarah Mortimer in the last session, where she was on the industry side, obviously as a buyer for Walmart and for in her work in industry. She's a lot vast experience of how to try to evaluate suppliers and providers and manufacturers of food and ingredients for her commercial companies. And we went into a lot of, discussion on that, and, how they're using data, how certification plays a part, but is just a starting point. And then the kind of concept of a walk around, talking to people about capability and culture and to try to get a sense of that. But that's not necessarily scalable as a buyer with tens of thousands of probably suppliers, or as a regulator with tens of thousands of organizations you need to regulate. So really interested in finding out more about your thoughts on how, regulators assess compliance around suppliers, food suppliers in particular, food manufacturers, even food service and retailers. So let's kick off, I guess, with that. How do regulators assess, supplier compliance and conformity with rules and regulations?
Sure. I think that's a very broad question because it has a lot of, I guess, variability on depending on where you are in the world to start with. So I guess I'll firstly give myself a disclaimer to say that a lot of my experience is generally based in the Australian environment, but is relatively transferable to most other well-developed nations with solid food safety systems.
Yeah.
Um, I think the first thing to really sort of state up front is that the clear difference between a regulatory role and a commercial role is that ultimately a regulator is looking at a standard that is compulsory. All businesses must comply with that standard, and it is the the lowest common denominator, if you like, that all businesses must meet in order to be operational. When I say that, there are various tools to manage those businesses that are non-compliant, depending on things that are in place around, whether it's that seriousness of non-compliance. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, we're looking at that legal basis to operate. Um, in terms of what we look at and how we look at those things, there are various methods that regulators use. Most people will be familiar with things like inspections or audits.
Mhm.
Uh, Regulators use a number of tools to assess compliance that are based on those minimum standards that are required to be met.
Mhm.
Um, but ultimately, it's not just about filling out a checklist. For regulators, really, it's about the behavior of the business. We want to see what the business is going to do when the regulator is not in the room.
Hmm.
So for us, it becomes a real focus on risk and behavior as a result of that. So a lot of, I was going to say a lot of onus and a lot more attention these days is being paid by regulators to uh, the culture of a business in that regard. How do businesses manage those food safety risks? How do they raise them, and how do they and identify them, and then how do they act on them to ensure that they're managed in a sustainable way?
Hmm. The fascinating thing, I think, is that there are these compulsory, as you call them, lowest common denominator requirements that are just absolutely mandatory to stay in business. And you're obviously checking that, but a lot of companies on their own basis would like to be, have standards well above that so that, they're providing that quality and safety and reassurance to their buyers and to the customers out there, the consumers. So, um, you know, tell me about like how you might evaluate that, how they're going above and beyond, those basic, absolute necessary requirements that the regulations would have in place, and what role does the regulator have in evaluating that, essentially?
I think that, yeah, you bring up a good point, and ultimately, from a regulatory perspective, you're either, as I said before, one of two states, compliant or not. It's
Yeah,
difficult to be evaluated as greater than compliant,
yeah.
given the nature and the legality around what the regulatory job is. But there are a number of regulators, including a regulator that I used to work with in Victoria and Queensland, and a couple in Australia, including one in Queensland, that have started to recognise these behavioural aspects of a business,
Mm-hmm.
and look at how that they sustain compliance in the longer term. Um, Really, those are set on models that are regulatory models that are truly risk based. So I guess
Mm-hmm.
you can't have any sort of recognition above that binary compliance or non-compliance state unless you have a truly risk-based regulatory framework to start with.
Exactly. So if you can evaluate the risk of a portfolio, a large portfolio of manufacturers and suppliers in the marketplace, can you use data to try to risk rank those in a sense so that you can prioritize more intensive or more frequent um, reviews or audits on the ones you feel would have a higher risk? Is that something you would have done, or something that's emerging in the regulatory environment?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say from the outset that regulators, whether you're working in food safety or any other regulatory scheme, are facing multiple challenges moving forward. If you want to
Mm.
focus on food safety for a moment, we've got a sector in agri-food globally which is growing at a rate that we've never seen before. We've got increasing investment into that sector. With food security being a question and global trade
Mm.
really driving that investment. Um, on the other hand, we've got restrictions on regulatory resources. So we've got restricting budgets. Regulators in general do have challenges with attracting and retaining staff, for example.
Mhm.
We see budget cuts that are happening. The geopolitical environment around the regulatory schemes globally is causing those resource bases to rapidly contract.
Mhm.
Um, but on the other hand, again, we've got a public expectation that there is a regulatory assurance that's stronger as
Yeah.
well.
Okay.
So really, in terms of what you're referring to, we need to be able to, as regulators moving forward, look at how we evaluate businesses and really focus from a regulatory perspective on what is the risk that an individual business holds in and of themselves.
Mhm.
What can we assess and gather in terms of information to give weight to where we are assessing them and
Yeah.
give transparency and accountability around those actions, and how can we then measure the effect of those and demonstrate it back to to our stakeholders, particularly in government and the public, that we're being effective. Um, and all of those things show that we've got good regulatory culture as well. So, there's a rising concept of this of regulatory culture,
Mm,
whereby all of these things around regulatory risk as well. So remember, we're not just talking necessarily about food safety risk, but as a
mhm,
regulator, you have legal requirements that you must cover off.
mhm.
Um, you must make sure that you manage those risks also.
Yeah, it's a challenging environment, as you say, with an expectation of food safety by the public, but a lack of resources or unwillingness to increase resources at least, and perhaps shrinking resources. So, I guess the opportunity to use more data and technology to help really zone in on priority areas is going to be essential in that environment, as you're mentioning. So. There's a question already coming in, so I might just come to that because it's relevant to regulation before we move on to some other topics. I'd like to get on to the future as well at the end, maybe talk about a bit about AI and data, so we'll come back to that. But for now, we'll stick with regulation. So, a question from Michael MacDonald. Thanks for your question. Regulation and, as importantly, enforcement play an enormous role in the food safety ecosystem. How can industry and regulators work, collaborate better together to raise standards and bring the food industry forward, whether a small, medium, or large food operator? That's a
Great
good
question,
question.
Michael. I think, I think there's a there's a big piece that transparency and consistency and accountability play in this conversation.
Hmm.
Ultimately, regulators need to be very upfront with the industries they regulate as to how they're going to treat businesses when they see certain circumstances appear, and stick to those undertakings and be accountable to that. I think that, in terms of enforcement action or certainly dealing with non-compliance, businesses must know where the line sits between, the regulator giving a little bit of rope for the business to take corrective action, or moving to the next stage where the regulator and the business work hand in glove to manage the situation,
Hmm.
or at the extreme, take that permission away from the business to operate so that they can manage to protect public health. So, in terms of the very first start, I always say that engagement is a key to many of these things.
Hmm.
I think the fundamental principle is that we all want the same thing, which is safe, consistent, sustainable, and profitable food supply chains. And that, the sooner we get on the same side of the table around that and engage around that to say, hey, we can tell you a story about how we as a regulator will operate. Can you tell us a story about how you as a business operate? And look at the Venn diagram of where those interests overlap. And in this case, particularly with respect to things like data, then it comes back again to behaviour. We know how each of those parties are going to behave, and we can be held accountable to those actions, both legally and from a procedural point of view.
Yeah, I'm curious about the work you're doing now with Cultivate and Risk Minds. How are you working with companies to help them on that journey? You mentioned behavior and culture and values, and I think they're all related. Behaviors are kind of a concrete manifestation of the values and culture of a company, right? And you can observe behaviors, and I know that you're big into trying to help companies with the culture of food safety. Could you talk a bit about the work you're doing there to, as in your current role, to help companies and as a byproduct regulators, I guess, as well, to
Yeah,
improve food
definitely.
safety?
So I think with with Cultivate SA, we've have a couple of food safety cultural maturity models that for both for manufacturing businesses, for retail businesses, and also for regulatory organisations that talk about really, some of the key focus areas and that we need to have in businesses that are more mature.
Hmm.
What that means is that, there are elements like, how we use data to influence behavior, um, and ultimately be able to demonstrate that, as a mature business or regulator, we're able to identify, act on, and manage those risks that come up in a proactive way.
Hmm.
As I said before, ultimately regulators want to be able to hear a story from a business. When something happens,
Yeah.
how have you identified that issue? How have you then behaved to manage it? How
Yeah.
has it then protected, the integrity and the safety of your final product? And then how have you gone back to review that process and improve performance?
Mm.
So we talk about that continuous improvement loop. Um, you know, both in food manufacturing businesses, but really, that is a key element of any of those cultural maturity models, and ultimately, it does come down to behaviour in all aspects.
Yeah.
So, as I said before, my personal interest in this was really came to the fore when I was working in regulatory authority, and I
Mm.
sort of was looking at how businesses implement their food safety systems. You could have businesses that had fantastic food safety control systems, very professionally presented, 3 or 4 folders deep on the shelf, but
Mm.
it didn't matter how technically good that tacit program was, or it all came down to how well they were implementing that in the plant, and how well those people that were given the responsibility to manage the risks around food safety were able to do so from a practical perspective. And that came back to, like Sarah was saying, watching the behaviours of people
Yeah.
in the plant.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's where the rubber hits the road, and it's very progressive to kind of, for a regulator, I think, to go beyond ticking a box and really try to understand that. So I find that very, very interesting. So let's move on. Maybe talk about a little bit about quality, fraud, and shelf life. We've done a lot of work on food integrity with a group called Fin, where industry are sharing data anonymously, and we're able to aggregate that information on food integrity and issues that arise in the supply chain anywhere in the world. And by sharing those insights, it can help companies prioritize their own audits and risk evaluation of their own suppliers. So that's been a very successful data sharing initiative where industries collaborated and now collaborating with government and regulators as well to share those insights to really help everyone understand, for everyone's benefit, where those weaknesses are in the supply chain and potential issues around fraud, which can lead to food safety. Not always, but a lot of times it can. So in terms of food fraud risks, what are kind of the biggest food fraud risks that you know of, maybe that regulators are currently monitoring, or have you come across in the past that were impactful?
Food fraud's an interesting space, and it's certainly one of those areas that is rising rapidly. I think that from a regulatory perspective, we look at it under traceability requirements. Do
Mm.
you know where the products come from? What evidence can you have to demonstrate that that product is it maintained its integrity through that process? And yeah, I think that as a concept, yeah, we are focusing more and more on it. There are, I think the point that I take away though from what you're saying is that the power of collective data in these areas
Mm.
is really able to shape behaviours, and being
Mm.
able to aggregate that information across an industry or a sector and feed that back, gives businesses an opportunity, or in fact actors, whether they're regulators or businesses or both,
Mm.
the opportunity to consider those risks from their own perspective. So, I mean, if we could take us back to the food safety point for a second, there's been some very nice instances of, regulators having that oversight. Regulators do have a unique perspective insofar as they are the only neutral body available
Mm.
that has oversight of all businesses that operate within their jurisdiction.
Mhm.
and as such have the ability to actually extract those insights and feed back to businesses or industries collectively to shape the way they behave. So in the instance where we have rising food fraud risks, it's about being able to bring that information together, to take that back again through an engagement channel to industry and say, hey guys, let's have a look at
Mhm.
this and do some work around this, whether it's surveillance work
Mhm.
or strengthening up our systems and do that collectively before it
Yeah.
becomes a significant issue of either non-compliance or worse.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what the Fin network has done is the industry's got together to create that insight, and share that knowledge, which is a very interesting aspect. And then it brought government regulators in later. I have a challenging question here, and it's something I think about a little bit, around clean label trends, which are, desirable, I suppose, from a, a marketing and a consumer's point of view, but also potentially conflicting with food safety and often and even shelf life. So what I'm saying there is, removing certain additives or preservatives from a food, might look good in terms of clean label and, no added preservatives or whatever, but or even upgrading the packaging and taking away, plastic and instead using some kind of organic cardboard or other material. But on the one side, that's good for clean label and environmental sustainability, perhaps. But then on the other hand, it can raise issues of shelf life or quality or even food safety. What are your thoughts on the challenges there? It's a tricky one, but I thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, and again, it depends on what
Yeah.
jurisdiction you're operating in.
Yeah.
So we're lucky enough in Australia to generally work on outcomes-based regulation. So effectively, in Australia, we flip that requirement on its head and say, you must demonstrate that packaging is safe and suitable for the product in which it's packaged. So that's a huge benefit for us. I think that when you get to more prescriptive regulatory standards, then the challenge becomes how do you go to the regulator or your standard setting body, whoever that might be, with a compelling argument, and it does come back to what evidence, what story can you tell around that, and how does it meet what the regulator is requiring. And there are lots of levers you can try and pull, and I think variously you're going to get different answers again depending on the the political nature of the day and the regime under which you're being regulated. But I guess that at a high level, the best rule is, as I said, being able to tell that story with
Mhm.
the evidence and data that you have to demonstrate that your product is not a greater risk or is actually an improvement in respect of food safety. And ultimately, again, as I said before, the lowest common denominator has to be the legal requirement. So things like, you know, removal of ingredients, for example, or additives on labels as a commercial requirement from a customer just doesn't float with a regulator if that's what's required, and ultimately the regulatory response will be to issue a non-compliance in that regard, or should be at least.
Exactly. So when you say evidence, we've come across a number of, cases where the only evidence that's acceptable is literally a scientific publication, or it's desirable to have a scientific publication, obviously, over just data or a white paper or something else. So that can take time.
Indeed.
But for sure, I think it's good science is always the best way to go in terms of trying to innovate, but also maintain the performance of food in terms of safety and shelf life. So let's move on to that's a great discussion on that. Finally, perhaps let's look to the future a little bit, or even the present, because we're looking at incredible advances in AI in the last number of years, in short number of years. In fact, the capability of these large language models to ingest much massive data and understand it and help us to distill it and analyze it and perhaps come up with even ideas from the data. How do you feel AI and data is being used in terms of regulation and compliance? Are we making the most of it as a industry and regulatory system, or what could we do more of, I suppose, on data and AI to help do this better?
Yeah, I think the rise of AI and its influence in regulation and government spheres more broadly is unstoppable. It's going to happen at some point for everybody, and I think that there are definitely benefits in being able to, for example, consume large amounts of
Mm,
data and provide insights for those from that information. But at the end of the day, from my perspective, and I've done a little bit of work with some of these tools, I think
mm,
that things like decisions and the way that they drive regulatory behaviour on the backside needs to be ultimately a human decision.
hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
we can't remove people from the process in this regard because there's always going to be, validation and verification that needs to occur for these models, and relying on them solely is I
mhm,
think is definitely a recipe for disaster.
yeah,
Um, then there's been a couple of instances where that automated models have caused some issues. If you want to have a look into the Australian robo-debt issue, then there was a big issue behind that. Not necessarily AI, but it was about automated systems that
yeah,
cause some very big problems. So ultimately, things like decisions must be justifiable. Regulators must be held to account on those decisions and be able to support them with evidence. That's good regulatory culture and best regulatory practice. And I think that using these tools is certainly going to help, but there must always be a person to review those decisions or those recommendations that are made.
yeah,
Um, and that certainly things like automation can assist when it comes down to the administrivia in government, when things like processing forms or automation of things that are very well and truly set. Having gone through a small started digital transformation in an agency myself, it was really
mm,
about looking at what those processes within that agency could be automated. Things like a license application, for example, is a key sort of regulatory system that can be automated at the front end, and you can use AI to help with decision making around whether this person needs a farm license or a manufacturing license or a transporter license, because there are some very basic decisions that are involved around that. But when it comes to things like deciding whether someone's a fit and proper person to hold a license, or
yeah.
making decisions that have legal weight, then a recommendation, sure, but a decision, no, it needs to be a human thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think these AI tools are powerful no matter what you're using them for, whether it's research or writing code or, doing whatever you're doing as a professional, you're ultimately the one who has to submit that report or stand over it. So you do need somebody at the top who's you know, judging the results of the analytics or the AI. So but it can bring great power in terms of efficiency, perhaps horizon scanning, risk prioritization. But obviously, you need to have a safety check there with people reviewing that and perhaps even overriding it as appropriate. We're just coming up on time. There are a couple of questions, and I see one here from Dermot Riley, who's a very innovative person in the food industry that I've known for many years. And he was asking about considering regulators are looking to collaborate with the food sector, how can we better integrate emerging innovations into risk management strategies? And this is interesting because obviously innovation moves fast, but perhaps the regulatory machine can be slow and requires more robust evidence, like I was saying, perhaps even scientific papers, which can take time. So, for example, barcodes took time to be used, but perhaps that was more just an industry issue. But then there are interesting things that I know Dermot's been working on, like nanotechnology, surface coatings, and even alcohol-based coatings, which are very effective against pathogens. But at the same time, they seem to be niche in their I suppose, acceptance. How can these kind of innovative technologies get more acceptance more quickly if they are effective? How can we, I suppose, accelerate that? Uh,
I I think engaging the regulator from day one is
yeah.
important, right? And being able to ensure that they're on the journey with you, as opposed to being hit at
Yeah.
the end with a large amount of data. I can, speak from my own experience in that respect. When novel technologies come forward, that being involved from day one, at least with an awareness, and generally speaking, governments and regulators are bound by the usual sort of non-disclosure arrangements that are in place for commercial arrangements as well. So, starting at the very beginning with them to say, this is what we're trying to achieve. Here's the steps we're going through. What sort of information are you going to need to ensure that we are,
Mhm.
maintaining food safety at the level that you expect? Um, and having that conversation, as I said, nice and early, and keeping them up to date on that. I think the other thing for regulators too, on the other side, is that from a regulatory culture perspective, when you're looking to always continually improve and be agile, you have to have the ability to set up what I'll refer to as a regulatory sandbox. So how do
Mhm.
we actually create some sort of alternative arrangement that has all the standard regulatory controls in place? So, if we have to take some severe action, then we can, but we can actually, with industry, set up a slightly alternative arrangement to ensure that we can trial these new things.
Mhm.
So in fact, the requirements don't change, but it's simply a different way to get there. So I
Yeah.
think there's kind of that both sort of parties have to come to the table on this and say, look, we want to regulators will need to be agile. Industry wants to trial new things and be more efficient as well, but we all again want the same thing.
Yeah.
And being able to have that open conversation from the very start um, is going to be important. But I will caveat to say that you know all that takes a lot of additional resources. It can do on both sides as well.
Yeah.
So there
With
there
resource.
is that there is
Yeah.
always a little bit of it's a two-edged, a double-sided, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, exactly. But as we were saying earlier, resources are not growing in this environment, so it'll be challenging to get the attention. But as you say, make it as easy as possible for the regulators to go on that journey with you in terms of new technologies. We've just going to wrap up in 1 minute, and thanks for the questions. We've one final question, Andrew, and it's an interesting one. We're talking about these constructive conversations between regulators and food safety, and we think of things like that can be conflicting. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, like sustainability versus food safety. Exact. Um, how do you have those constructive conversations with regulator on food safety and sustainability? Well, when perhaps the science and technology are still emerging. So,
Probably refer a little bit to my
yeah,
previous
exactly.
answer,
You kind
but
of
I think
answered
that
it. Yeah.
from a regulatory point of view, again, regulators are always going to hold up food safety as the paramount thing.
Yeah.
It's not going to, it's not if it's more sustainable, but raises the risk around food safety. It just doesn't pass muster, and a lot of people will always I guess that from a political point of view, because ultimately all regulators have, in some regards, have to answer to governments of the day. The governments are looking to minimise burden on the public health system first and
Yeah.
foremost, and it will always be front of mind in that regard. But I think to go back to the behaviour thing again, being able to approach a regulator, being able to have that honest and open conversation, shows them that you're willing to engage on these things early, um, and hopefully they should reciprocate that engagement as well. So
Yeah.
that those sort of behaviours give you confidence as a regulator as well, that if there is any
Yeah.
issues, you're going to hear about them early from those businesses.
And just one final question to get back to our main topic of the day. What advice could you give to suppliers aiming to stay ahead of regulatory and retailer expectations in this modern day?
Probably the again the biggest piece of advice is a bit of a, as I said before, a bit of a mantra for me is engagement's key here. All right,
Mhm.
so don't be afraid to talk to your regulator
Mm,
about these things,
mm,
and many cases, certainly from my experience anyway, when I was working in the regulatory space, it was already always very much appreciated
mm,
when you want to bring them up and talk to them about perhaps the rising risk you've seen or something like that. Because as I mentioned earlier, with resources being ever tighter, we're going to require that engagement relationship with businesses to structure the way we look at our overall compliance scheme. So, we're
yeah,
seeing all of these resource shortcomings happen right now in the US and in the UK and so forth. So it is going to continue in that regard. So, as I said, my one key piece of advice is engage with your regulator.
yeah. Okay, well, I think that's super perspective, and thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us this evening, your time this morning in Europe, on this series of how retailers, regulators can evaluate suppliers. I think it was a fascinating conversation. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for your questions, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks and goodbye.